Hello, I'm Christine Middlemas, the UK Chief Veterinary Officer. I'd like to welcome you today to our Avian Influenza webinar for vets and veterinary practices. We're going to take you through the latest update in our avian influenza situation, information on detection of the virus in birds that you're seeing for vets, and then further contact details and information that may be helpful to you. This winter, 2021-22, we're seeing the biggest avian influenza outbreak we've ever had in the UK. And it's all of one subtype, highly pathogenic H5N1 virus. It's being seen across the continent in Europe and elsewhere. Currently, today, on the 7th of January, we have 77 confirmed cases in the UK. 64 of these in England, 3 in Wales, 5 in Scotland, and 5 in Northern Ireland. It's a really significant outbreak. And our risk comes from migrating wild birds and will stay with us until they start to leave the UK. So we're expecting what we currently assess as this very high incursion risk of infected wild birds to be with us into March. This level translates for our own kept birds to a high risk of infection where biosecurity is poor, and a medium risk of infection where biosecurity is good. So it's really absolutely key that all bird keepers, whether they have one bird or tens of thousands of birds kept commercially, are absolutely scrupulous in cleanliness. And that means that every time you enter a bird shed, even if you walked across a yard and have just left one, you recheck and re-clean before you go in, and everything that enters that shed, because of this very high level of wild bird infection that we have. As infection levels rose in wild birds, we brought in Great Britain on the 3rd of November the Avian Influenza Prevention Zone, which statutorily requires high levels of biosecurity. This then followed as we reached this very high level of incursion with additional housing measures on the 29th of November. All birds are required to be housed as a preventative measure. But it's biosecurity and cleanliness that has the greatest impact. An EFSA report indicates that there is a 44-fold reduction in the risk level from having absolutely scrupulous cleanliness and biosecurity. And in this webinar, we're going to explain some more of the detail about what that involves and some of the specific findings from the outbreak so far that will help you and your clients better target your actions. I'm going to hand over to Lara now, who will take you through some more details of this specific virus. Over to you, Lara. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Christine, and welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Lara Harrop, and I'm one of the policy team leads in the Defra Exotic Disease Control team. I'm just going to give a short introduction, sort of 101 to what avian influenza is and how it's spread, before I pass over to epidemiology and veterinary colleagues to really provide some details about what actions as veterinarians you can inform your clients to take to help protect their birds, and how you can interact with both Defra and the Animal and Plant Health Agency if you suspect avian influenza in any of the birds you see. So avian influenza is the causative agent of avian influenza, colloquially known as bird flu. It's an enveloped, single-stranded, segmented RNA virus. And the important point of this is that that means it's phospholipid membrane, means it's susceptible to breaking that down through cleansing and disinfection. So our epidemiology colleagues will link back to that later about how important that is as a feature in biosecurity. So in terms of the terminology of how avian influenza is described, viruses consist of proteins, and avian influenza viruses are classified using the H and N proteins. There are 16 different H proteins and 9 different N proteins in influenzas affecting birds, and any combination of these is possible with limited cross protection between them. However, from an animal health perspective, the H5 and H7 influenzas are considered the most important from an animal health perspective and are the notifiable subtypes. So, as Christine mentioned, all the avian influenza cases in the UK this winter have been of a European strain of H5N1 avian influenza. This European strain of H5N1 is highly contagious for birds, but the UK Health Security Agency advised that the risk to the general public's health is very low. And the Food Standards Agency advised that there is very low food safety risk for UK consumers, and properly cooked poultry and other poultry products, including eggs, are safe to eat. This is important to know, and it may be an issue of concern for many of your clients, because there has been historic cases globally of an Asian strain of H5N1 that did have increased public health concerns. However, this European strain is considered a very low risk to the general public's health. However, a precautionary approach is always taken by regional public health protection teams for people who have come into either very close contact or prolonged contact with infected birds. And as veterinary practitioners, appropriate PPE precautions should be taken if you have any suspicion of avian influenza in birds you are seeing. And colleagues will come on to that later in today's webinar. One of the other principal characterisations for avian influenza is your ability to cause severe disease. If we have the next slide, please. With strains either classified as highly pathogenic avian influenza, which can often cause severe disease and is often fatal in susceptible birds. If I could have the next slide, please. Or they can be classified as low pathogenic avian influenza, which generally are either asymptomatic or cause mild to moderate disease. This can include mild to moderate respiratory symptoms, drops in egg production, secondary infections. While highly pathogenic avian influenzas, as mentioned, often fatal in birds. However, clinical signs in birds for both of these classifications can vary between bird species. But highly pathogenic avian influenza can often present as sudden mortality, often up to 100% in a flock, severe drop or stop in egg productions, respiratory symptoms and swelling of the sinuses, edema and subcutaneous bleedings, diarrhea and neurological signs, and postmortem findings, however, are highly variable, but often are associated with petechia and hemorrhage in carcasses. Veterinary colleagues will come on to further details of this later in today's webinar. It's important to note, though, that while low pathogenic avian influenza can cause these mild to asymptomatic infections, we are still concerned with this, in particular for those H5 and H7 strains, because if the low pathogenic avian influenza gets into a flock, as it starts spreading within that flock, it can change into a highly pathogenic avian influenza, which has consequential impacts for both the health and welfare of the flock, and also, dependent on the strain, increased public health concerns. So one of the aspects we want to touch on is just how it is spread and how this links to the biosecurity measures you can be advising your clients to take. So the UK faces a seasonal increased risk of avian influenza associated with migratory wild birds. However, the risk is not just associated with where those migratory wild birds are, as once those migratory wild birds, if they're infected, arrive in the UK, they can go on to infect other local and sedentary wild bird species, poultry or captive birds if they come into contact with them. The virus can be transmitted both directly between birds or indirectly by birds coming into contact with environmental contamination. This could include things such as feces and feathers from infected birds. And this is where high standards of biosecurity should be being advised to both within your practices and to your clients to be maintained as good practice for the health of your birds, because good biosecurity is really the essential defence against any diseases such as avian influenza, and it's key to limiting the spread of avian influenza in an outbreak. You should also be advising your clients that it's not just good biosecurity. This must be coupled with close vigilance of their birds, and that any signs of disease, they should be seeking your advice, both from a welfare perspective, if they're having issues with complying with the housing order, any potential behavioural issues associated with that, seeking advice on that, and also any animal health issues. Going to pass on now to epidemiology colleagues who'll just be able to run through how in practice, both yourselves within your practice and your clients can implement on the ground some of these biosecurity measures to help stop the spread of avian influenza and protect their birds.
That's great. Thanks, Lara. My name's Andy Patterson. I'm the head of the National Emergency Epidemiology Group and the Field Epidemiology Team, and we're responsible for investigating individual disease outbreaks and bringing the pieces together to better understand the disease situation throughout the country. So if we look back on the disease outbreak that we had last year, all of the infected premises in that outbreak were attributed to either direct contact with wild birds or indirect contact through, for example, fecal material being moved on clothing or boots into houses or on equipment. We didn't have any evidence of long distance spread between premises last year, apart from where the premises were close together and were part of the business, of the same business. So they were essentially almost on one site, but they were, from a technical point of view, separate premises. Now, the biosecurity within these businesses wasn't effective, and it did allow, through business practice, some of the virus to move around. Last year, that was not significant. There weren't a large number of those. Now, one of the frustrating things is that when we look at premises, and a lot of our investigation time is spent looking at how the disease got in and how it spread, we find that the different components for biosecurity are there, but they're generally not done very well. So we find the facilities are poorly maintained. There's inconsistent record keeping. For example, there is disinfectant, but there's no effective washing facilities, things like that. So it really is a case of making sure that all the different components are there, they're well maintained, and they're used effectively. So if we could move on to the next slide. So just as an overview of what we're trying to achieve with biosecurity, we want to emphasize that this isn't, we're not asking your clients to undertake some form of rocket science. We're not asking them to follow the type of containment procedures that we expect in our high containment laboratories. What we're asking them to do is follow very basic good practice and do this well and do it all the time, because it's really important that you do biosecurity all year round, even when you don't have disease, because you may well be that first case, or you may be the first case in an area. So it's very important to make it part of your normal business practice. Now, the things I'm going to talk to you about, these are all findings that we record on a system we call Verdo, where when we investigate disease, we record all the risk factors we identify, and we can correlate them across all the different infected premises to find what really was significant. But the important thing I think you need to bear in mind is how tiny the dose is that's needed to cause an infection. I mean, we've got a situation here where you only need to infect one bird in a shed, and then the rest of the population will amplify that. So it's really a petrol and a match situation. If you've got a situation where you've got a susceptible population, you only need to infect one bird by walking it in with very tiny dose on your feet, and that's enough to cause an outbreak. It's important that you don't rely on a hard outer shell for your business. If your clients are putting all their emphasis on their gate and having disinfection and washing at the gate, having record keeping, that's good. But really the way the disease is getting in many of these cases is at the shed door. So you need to have good biosecurity at the shed door with cleaning and disinfection of boots. Ideally, you need to have internal, external clothing so that there are shed-specific boots and clothing. And that needs to become part of everyday business practice. I've talked about the value of doing biosecurity when you don't have disease, but it's also important to note that biosecurity, as well as being effective for diseases like AI, it also will have benefits for endemic disease such as salmonella. So, and that all of that, bringing it into your normal business culture, will improve your disease status throughout. Now, licensing is always something that our commercial businesses that we deal with are, it's very close to their hearts, because you can limit the impact on your business by being able to license products on and off. Now, it's never a good thing to have disease, so this is only minimizing the impact, but you must bear in mind that licensing is not a given, and it basically, a license permits you to do something that is otherwise illegal under the circumstances. And one of the key factors to do with being granted a license to undertake an activity is to be able to demonstrate the biosecurity, because licensing depends on the evidence and the trust, and you need to be able to provide good records in an accessible format for us to make an evidence-based judgment on whether or not a license is appropriate. And that evidence you provide, that goes into a formal risk assessment to underpin the decision. So I think, in summary, biosecurity in general, there aren't any really easy answers on that. It requires real effort. Your clients are not going to really improve up their game by tinkering around the edges. They've got to really integrate biosecurity into the way the business is run, and it needs to become part of the culture of their business from the managing director down in all parts. So if you could move on to the next slide, please. Right, this is just a short summary of some of the key issues that we've identified both last season and this season. So I've talked about this issue of perimeter biosecurity, not focusing just on the hard outer shell. If you can imagine, even if you've got lots of lovely concrete all around your sheds, that's easily contaminated with bird feces. Each of those bird feces contains hundreds of infectious doses. You won't even be able to see the infection on your feet if you're walking it around. And we would encourage you to talk to your clients about thinking about biosecurity in terms of, I know that Public Health England did a campaign a few years ago on influenza, and they gave people dye on their hands that was ultraviolet, showed up under an ultraviolet light, and they put them in a normal situation to see how far the ultraviolet light active dye spread, and within a couple of hours the entire premises was covered in ultraviolet dye. So what I'd like to say, give you an image, is that if you could imagine the outside of your premises had something like emulsion paint on it, and you had to make sure that nobody walked emulsion paint into your shed, that gives you an idea of the level of cleanliness and biosecurity that you need. You need to make sure that even the almost invisible levels of contamination on your boots and clothing do not get walked in and have contact with the susceptible birds. Bedding management is a key issue. We've identified bedding as a problem in several IPs where either the bedding has been badly stored and has been contaminated with bird feces, or when the bedding is brought into the house, it's brought in by machines which drive over the curtilage of the building into the shed and contaminate the inside of the shed with fecal contamination that's come from outside. So it's really important that bedding is stored under cover. It's double wrapped. When you bring it into the shed, you see indeed the vehicle going into the shed or the trolley that you're using, and you see indeed the outside of the bale. You remove the outer wrapping, bring it in, and then distribute it. Similarly, some production systems, they have very high levels of bedding use, and if you can, it's very useful to keep your bedding in the shed from the beginning of the production cycle, and so you don't have to top up often, because topping up is another source of introducing infection. If you move on to building maintenance, it's really important that you ensure that there are no gaps or holes that wild birds or rodents can get in. We believe that rodents are as significant for avian influenza as they are for salmonella spread. Wild birds obviously coming in will either directly or indirectly contaminate the environment. And the other important issue is roofs. It's really important not to have leaking roofs. We've seen a number of IPs where the infection has been introduced from water dripping through from a contaminated roof onto the bedding, and then we've seen the infection spread up and down the house from where the water is dripped in. So these are real practical observations of the introduction of infection. Also, location. It's obviously very difficult for your clients to change the location of their entire business, but you have to accept that if you set up a business that's near a coast or a wetland, it's under a recognized migration route, etc., you're essentially building your business in a high crime area for the purpose of disease control. So you're going to be much more likely to become infected. So it'd be useful to give some thought to any expansion to clients' businesses and where they are more likely to become infected. And we've certainly been using ornithological expert assessments of areas, and we've found them very useful to risk assess particular sites for introduction of infection. The other important thing is, as we talked about, the mindset of the business and the management and the controlling mind. It's really important that as a senior manager in a business that people don't rely on just the fact you have a standard operating procedure on file and it all reads nicely. You should be out looking at your business, checking that what's in the SOP is actually done and that people are adhering to it, because that's ingrained in the culture. And again, it's no good telling people to do it if you're not doing it yourself. And certainly when our investigators go on site, we expect them not only to be fully C&D'd and following biosecurity protocols, but to be seen to be doing that. And that just basically sets the standard that we expect of our inspectors going onto site. And it's a bit like with COVID, when you wear a face mask, you're not just protecting yourself, you're making a statement about your acceptable level of protection for disease control. So having C&D at your gate, having signs up, having boot dips that are properly designed and maintained beside sheds, all these things are making visible statements about what you expect from your staff, yourself and your visitors on your site. Record keeping, these are really important. We use the production records, medicine records, feed consumption records to help us devise the timeline for infection. That timeline limits the tracings and other investigations that we've got to do, and it can also help with your licensing as well. So it's really important that your clients keep good records. They keep them in a format that we can easily access and that we can analyze. And you should be able to use those records yourselves and your clients to look for disease patterns and potentially spot disease incursion earlier and be able to report it to us earlier. Going on to cleansing and disinfection, I think the point here is there's no point disinfecting if you're not cleansing. Most disinfectants are inactivated by organic matter and mud, and both organic and matter and mud can also just physically shield the virus from the disinfectant. So it's really important that you don't simply spray a bit of disinfectant around. You have to physically clean the item first, whether it be boots or a feed lorry or whatever, before you spray the disinfectant on. I've talked about personal protective equipment. Again, you need to make sure that your staff are using their personal protective equipment properly, that ideally you should be aiming for shed-specific personal protective equipment, and just ensuring that becomes habitual and part of the process. We've talked about virus survival. We can sort of discuss with detail about how long the virus takes to survive, but the key message is it's the weeks of survival at this time. So it's not a case of something that will quickly decay away. Once it's introduced there, it's a risk for a long period of time. Flooding is another feature that has triggered a number of infected premises recently. We've been quite surprised by the number of premises that report, oh yes, we get flooding occasionally, we just spray a bit of Virkon around and that sorts it out. Well, we know that the flooding either brings infection in from the land around or from the concrete surroundings on the buildings, washes in a lot of fecal material, a lot of virus, and we've seen some very sudden explosive outbreaks of avian influenza following flooding incidents. Ponds, again, a very difficult thing from a practical point of view. Ponds are often a requirement of planning applications for fire prevention, things like that. People are often encouraged to dig ponds for environmental reasons, but they do attract wild birds. And if you're going to have a pond close to your birds, even, especially we come across free range units where the ponds are within the ranges and there are ducks on the ponds commingling with the poultry. This is just not a good thing from a disease point of view. So if you're going to have a pond, you need to discourage the wildlife from accessing it and perhaps think about netting it. That would be one solution. But again, from a practical point of view, very difficult to deal with. Where you have separate premises under the same management, it's very easy for basic biosecurity to break down, to have staff sharing across different buildings, maybe under time pressure, maybe not adhering to biosecurity. So where you have got a large integrated business with premises under the same management, it's especially important to make sure that you treat each of your individual premises like separate businesses and make sure the biosecurity between them is effective. The other important thing with biosecurity is really looking at the resilience of your business. How will your business survive if you do get an incursion of avian influenza? We're fully aware that businesses grow organically. They often aren't planned from the beginning, and it's very convenient to have a feed mill or a hatchery or whatever on very close to or on the same site as your business. But what will happen if you become an infected premises? What impact will that have for you? And I think it's really important that as part of your biosecurity plan, you also have a contingency plan for having disease to try and reduce the impact on your business. And an important part of that is getting your allocation of CPHs right, so that you are clearly and legally, your holdings are identifiably separate from an administrative point of view, and you can demonstrate that they are separate from a biosecurity point of view. We've talked about licensing earlier, just to emphasize again that licensing is evidence-based, and you need to be in a position to provide us with evidence that you can satisfy the conditions of the license. And if we could move on to the next slide, please. And I'll finish there from the epidemiology point of view.
Hello everyone, my name is Christian Churlik. I'm one of the senior veterinary inspectors based in the southeast of England, and I'm going to talk through some of the aspects of APHA's field delivery regarding the avian influenza. I will start with what happens when suspicion of disease is reported. So owners, private vets, official veterinarians or laboratory are the most frequent sources of the reports. Across small holding flocks to multi-shed and multi-site enterprises, the principles of APHA response are the same. It's either the poultry keeper or the private veterinary surgeon identifying any of the main clinical signs. We encourage to call APHA by using the single point contact number, which was in the previous slide. Then there is a selection one, which has specifically implemented to report suspicion of avian influenza. Therefore, you're not going to be waiting on the line to be put through an operator. In the case you, as a private vet, is going to be the one reporting the suspicion of avian influenza, this is regarded as a consultation case, which implies that APHA vets will liaise initially with you to gather information about the history of the disease and details of the premises where the disease is suspected. You will then be put through a customer advised duty vet that will take the details of the premises, details of the clinical situation, and ask you about what made you suspect the avian influenza. If the initial assessment done over the phone concludes that notifiable disease cannot be ruled out, verbal restrictions will be imposed on the premises suspected. The customer advised duty vet will then call a regional veterinary officer within the geographic area where the birds are located, and then the vet will be deployed within no more than 30 minutes from notification being made. Once arrived on farm, following the biosecurity protocols, formal restrictions will be placed on the premises, and then the veterinary investigation will commence. This veterinary investigation includes clinical inspection and/or examination of the birds and possibly sampling whilst adhering to the strict biosecurity measures. Also, at the time of this veterinary inspection, data will be gathered including disease history, movements on and off of animals, feed, bedding, and details about the number of people attending the birds and the level of their involvement. After this thorough investigation, there could be two outcomes. Either the disease can be ruled out by the veterinary officer on clinical grounds, or disease cannot be ruled out and further actions will be taken. APHA, for quality assurance purposes, has a system in place where a telephone report will be made from the farm by the investigating vet to one of the veterinary officers in Vendel in London, and after going through the details of the clinical picture and disease history, a decision will be made if disease is not suspected and can be negated, in which case the restrictions will be lifted and the owner of the birds will be directed to seek advice from you as a private veterinary surgeon, or the disease cannot be ruled out and samples will be taken and sent to the lab. The number and the nature of the samples will be based on advice received from vendor and will depend on the species of birds that are on the site where disease is suspected, but other factors can be taken into consideration. These samples will be sent by courier from the farm directly to the APHA laboratory in Weybridge, and after arrival, a PCR test will be done and results will be normally available within 24 hours. It could be two outcomes. If the results are negative and further virus isolation tested at day 2 confirms it, we will inform the owner or you about the outcome and restrictions will be lifted, and then the investigation will end. But in the case of the results being positive, as well as the virus isolation tested 2 days which gives us preliminary results, a further test at 6 days will be performed. So there will be a definite final result will be available around 6 days following the investigation on farm. However, APHA will action after the preliminary results are available, and once the Chief Veterinary Officer is content, we will proceed to organize the valuation of the stock no sooner than 24 hours before culling, and then we'll cull the remainder of the birds on site. This valuation is done taking in consideration how many birds are dead, ill, or look healthy at the time of the assessment, because compensation is only payable for the birds that look healthy at the time of the valuation. Then the culling is performed humanely under the supervision of one of the APHA vets or a contracted one to ensure that the welfare of the birds is not compromised. Regardless of how fast we would like to deal with any case, the welfare of the birds is paramount until the very end. The disposal of the dead poultry and any other poultry products will be dealt by APHA, and then finally will be from the delivery point of view is the preliminary cleansing and disinfection, performed normally by one of the APHA technical officer, and followed by a written report within after the 24 hours have elapsed. The owner of the premises will then be allocated a case vet, and the follow-up procedures will be discussed with this vet. And these follow-up procedures entail secondary cleansing and disinfection, this time at the owner's expense, and the restrictions will only be lifted after the APHA is satisfied with the procedures. So as soon as the owners deal with the secondary cleansing and disinfection procedures, the better. Can I have the next slide, please? Right, so in case once a notifiable disease is ruled out after the initial investigation, the owner has the option in liaison with you as a private vet to submit additional samples to investigate other possible conditions or request differential testing at their expense. This will give a great surveillance value, but will also give great benefits to bird health and welfare by knowing the causing agent in time, so treatment, when applicable, can be starting as soon as possible. Also, carcasses can be submitted for post-mortem investigation at APHA veterinary investigating centers. Normally it's last weight, but any other third-party providers can be used. The costs of the testing will be applied irrespective of the results and are subject to review and available on the APHA website. In case there's a suspicion of any other diseases lurking around, owners and you as private vets are encouraged to contact Avian Expert Group via the email address provided to discuss any individual cases. Can I have the right? The clinical presentation of the high pathogenic avian influenza can vary, but most importantly, it's a sudden mortality up to 100% in a very short period of time. Also, there's many other clinical signs, but not necessarily all come together. There could be severe drop and stop in egg production. It could be respiratory symptoms and swelling of the sinuses, edema or subcutaneous bleeding, and most likely and most frequently diarrhea and neurological signs. The post-mortem findings highly vary, but often petechia and hemorrhages found in carcasses. I'll come back to that a little bit later. But please note that this is highly contagious. It's really a disease of numbers. A sudden mortality with a high number is more likely. In addition to the common signs of avian influenza, which include respiratory, neurological, and enteric presentation, you should consider reporting avian influenza disease in case you find large decrease in feed and water intake, considerable acute drop in egg production with an increased proportion of pale eggs or seconds or deformed eggs, and a history of acute, high, and rapidly escalating unexplained mortality and morbidity. You see in these pictures, normally when we go to investigate cases on farm, we come across quite often to cyanosis of the combs and wattles. And on the next slide, we see, as you see on the right-hand side bottom picture, there's a shed where the mortality is up to 100%, but mortality can vary between 0 to 100% in a short period of time. As vets, you should consider a differential diagnosis of respiratory diseases in poultry, and you see in this table here the avian influenza, infectious bronchitis, and infectious laryngotracheitis, and also mycoplasmosis and infectious grazers. So all these can have a different presentation, but in the case of avian influenza, it's imperative to have in mind this high mortality and morbidity in a very short period of time. There's also high mortality in the infectious laryngotracheitis. However, as opposed to avian influenza, is the egg lay, where the egg lay stops within 3 days. There's going to be acute respiratory disease with central nervous sign and high mortality. Can I have the next slide, please? The post-mortem findings on avian influenza in the high path avian influenza is generalized carcass and visceral congestion, and all the organs are to levels that we haven't seen before, organomegaly with multifocal hemorrhages and pancreatitis. There's an intense congestion and cyanosis of the comb and nares and beak, as you've seen in the picture before. Severe congestion and edema on feet and shanks. Oral mucosa hemorrhages with hyperemia of the beak, nares, wattles, and also skin, and multifocal pancreatic necrosis and hemorrhages. The PME the post-mortem findings, as you see, hemorrhages of the legs the legs are quite congested, severe red trachea with also congestion. Well, just like I said for the differential diagnosis of negated cases, if avian notifiable disease not highly suspected but cannot be excluded from the differential diagnosis, there's an option for the owner of the birds in liaison with the private veterinary surgeon to submit additional samples to test for exclusion of notifiable disease. This testing at the moment is currently available only for chickens and turkeys, so it's not permitted on game birds or ducks. The samples collected will be following a consultation with vendor and will be tested for avian influenza or avian paramyxovirus virus type 1, or both, depending on what you have requested on the submission form. Testing will be a PCR, and results will normally be available in no more than 48 hours after the samples being received. Samples may also be submitted to the laboratory over the weekend or public holidays with a request for testing to start on the next working day. In those cases, the test turnaround will start from 9 o'clock on the next working day, and once again the results will be available within 48 hours. Further information can be found on the links that you have in this slide. it's precious information that you should have handy whenever you suspect avian influenza in any flocks. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for attending the webinar.